Good afternoon, Dr. Kwok Pui Lan. Welcome.
Good afternoon.
It's good to see you, and welcome to all of our visitors or viewers. My name is Richard Lawson. I'm the Dean of St. John's Cathedral, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual Everding Lecture here at St. John's Cathedral. And before I introduce our lecture, let us pray. This is a 5th century prayer from St. Augustine of Hippo. O God, from whom to be turned is to fall, to whom to be turned is to rise, and in whom to stand is to abide forever. Grant us in all our duties your help, in all our perplexities your guidance, in all our dangers your protection, and in all our sorrows your peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Dr. Kwok, welcome. You are coming to us from Atlanta, Georgia, where you are the Professor of Systematic Theology at the Candler School of Theology, which is a part of Emory University. You're the past president of the American Academy of Religion. Pui Lan has authored and edited numerous books, all of which you can find online. And one of my favorites is a book of hers called Post-Colonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, which will soon appear in the comment section here, and from which that book I'll offer at least a few questions to Pui Lan. She's also the editor of Women and Christianity in 4 volumes, and her upcoming book is called Post-Colonial Politics and Theology, which should appear before the end of the year. Pui Lan, I do want to acknowledge that you are here based upon the generosity of Lee Everding. And Lee Everding is a great supporter of St. John's Cathedral, a wonderful member of the cathedral. And Lee's beloved husband, God rest his soul, is named Ed. Ed died a few years ago. And this lecture is named after Ed and Lee. So we give thanks for Ed and we give thanks for Lee. And that also means that you've done a little bit of teaching at ILEF. How are things going with your work with ILEF this fall?
The course that I'm teaching is doing very well. And I want to thank St. John's Cathedral and Dean Lawson for hosting this afternoon. I want to say hello to those who are joining this particular session. And I want to thank Ms. Lee Everding for her generosity in providing the funds for this particular lectureship. And I have heard good things about Dean Ed Everding's ministry in ILEF and beyond. So it is a great honor to be invited as the Everding lecturer for this year. And I look forward to this great conversation with you, Richard.
As do I. Well, welcome. And I do want to add that Ed was the president or dean of ILEF School of Theology, and he was a New Testament professor. And we'll talk a little bit about an important New Testament figure here in a bit, and a lot more at our Bible study on Wednesday evening, which I'll say a word about the Wednesday evening Bible study between the two of us at the end of this conversation. So welcome. I can't resist saying, Pui Lan, that it's a beautiful day here in Denver. We have blue skies and the weather has finally broken. It feels like fall. What's the weather like in Atlanta these days?
These days, sometimes it is hot and sometimes it is just beginning to change as well.
Yeah. Yeah, have the leaves begun to change yet there in Atlanta?
Sometimes, yes. It depends on which part.
Yes. Well, let's talk about post-colonial theology, which is really what you're known for. I mean, in addition to feminist theology and a couple of other perspectives, but you are closely associated with post-colonial theology. How did you get into this work, and when did this become such an important lens for you?
I must start from the very beginning of how I became a Christian and became interested in theology. I was not born in a Christian family. A neighbor of ours brought me to the church. And that church was Holy Trinity Church. Today, it is Holy Trinity Cathedral. And I hope some of those participants joining online will be able to just Google Holy Trinity Cathedral. And then you will see my beautiful former church. Why? Because it was built in a Chinese architectural style. When you look at it, you thought that you're looking at a Chinese temple, not a Christian church. So when I was young, as a teenager joining the church, I did not understand the significance. But it was from hindsight that I could still see in the eye of my mind Christian symbolisms, the grapes, and also the Holy Trinity symbol, because it's named Holy Trinity Church. But there was also other Chinese symbols too. That is the thunder and the cloud, and also the architectural style conjures up a different space. Not only that, Richard, when I was a teenager, I had a woman as the vicar or the rector of my church. Her name is Reverend Wang Xinyuan. She and the Reverend Joyce Bennett were the two women officially ordained in the whole Anglican Communion in 1971. That was also the year that I went to college and began to study theology. And that was also the time when we had protests around the world. Remember here in the United States, the late 60s and 70s? So we had protests and demonstrations in Hong Kong, in Europe, in the United States. So I began to think, what had those protests and demonstrations to do with me going to college studying theology? So it came from a long beginning. And then later, Hong Kong, where I was born, was returned to China in 1997. So before that, colleagues in Hong Kong had been talking about preparing for a post-colonial era for Hong Kong. So it was at that time, some 20-some years ago, that I began this journey to look more closely at what is post-colonial. And it happened in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Asia earlier. And what I, as a theologian, had to say and continue to say to the changes that have been happening in the world.
Interesting. So that is a perfect beginning. And not only because it's true, it's a perfect launching to thinking about post-colonial theology. So a part of what post-colonial theology is drawing attention to is the relationship between Christianity and culture or cultures. And your architectural example is fascinating because it means that your Anglican Episcopal Church had an indigenous architecture. It was not a neo-Gothic English architecture. So that's a part of what we're here to talk about, correct? Is that relationship then between culture or cultures? It could be architecture, it could be language, it could be associations around gender, you name it, and Christianity.
Yes, indeed, because we belong to the Anglican Communion. We say we have more than 80 million Anglicans around the world from more than 165 countries. And so the church in Atlanta or in Denver and the church in Nairobi or Hong Kong would be very different. And how we remained in communion and fellowship is the biggest challenge we face today.
Well, let's talk about a different example. Look at it through the same lens, but it's a different example because it's the polar opposite of your architectural example from growing up in Hong Kong. In your book, Post-Colonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, there's a wonderful introduction, and I commend it to anybody who wants to learn more, because the introduction really is an introduction to post-colonial theology. And one of the things you do is you give this example, and I'll quote from you a full sentence. You're talking about Christopher Columbus's journal, and you write, "It's revealing that in Columbus's journal, the intruders were not described as Spaniards or Italians or Europeans, but as Christians. And the Indians were portrayed as people available for conversion." So that's the opposite example. We would talk about that tragic example, which really set the stage for much that was to follow.
Yeah, I think that this is a very important episode of human history, because the so-called New World Order was born. Why? Because the Americas was then connected to the other parts of the world that human beings have known. And when you came to a foreign land, and later I'm talking about the colonization of the Americas, and you would not go for the benefit of telling yourself, I am interested in the resources and colonizing the people and then reaped profit. There must be lofty ideals or reasoning behind that gesture of either colonization of people or enslavement of people. So at that time, the Europeans came to this part of the world. They told themselves they were doing something good for the Native Americans, which for them would be to evangelize for the saving of their souls, and even sometimes maybe using violent means. And so I think from the very beginning, when Americas was, in quotation mark, discovered by Europeans, and the whole syndrome of Christianity connecting with empire expansion was there. And that is why I think my work as a post-colonial theology is to tease out, to unpack what happened. And then some of the rhetorics are being heard today, repeating the same imperial logic. So that is why I have been learning so much from Black theologians in the United States, indigenous theologians, and also the theologians from Latin America as well.
Yes, and continuing with that example of Columbus and just pushing it a bit further. So what Columbus didn't do was simply come here and share the gospel. Columbus also came here and shared his culture. It was a culture of conquest. So it's the polar opposite of the Christianity that you grew up with, which was looking for how to synthesize perhaps Christ and our beliefs and rituals with indigenous culture, indigenous architectural forms, indigenous language, et cetera, et cetera. So it does seem to be something of the opposite, correct?
I think that it is very complicated. Why? Because to say that the colonial Christianity was completely bad, well, that is just one way of looking at it. There were many, many other ways too. That is, we should not just emphasize Columbus and also the other colonizers' activities. We should also see how the indigenous people responded. And that is why in the field of world Christianity, we are beginning to pay more attention to local agency, how the gospel was received, indigenized, and evangelized by the people for the benefit of their own. And I think this is also very important because there is one layer, we have the Constantinian Christianity, that is Christianity working with empire. But on the other hand, the indigenous people, the slaves, for example, in United States and Canada and in Latin America, they have also responded to a gospel that I would say would be very liberating for themselves, and also a contribution to learning about what is Jesus Christ's gospel.
So in other words, this marriage of Christianity and Westernization has the seeds within it of its own undoing.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I think that we should not underestimate the Spirit works in strange ways, isn't it?
Yes.
Without the extension of the British Empire, there will be no Anglican Communion.
Yes.
Because where the crown goes, the cross goes as well.
Yeah.
But strangely, God has greater plans for all of us. And then in God's mystery, the people who receive this gospel find a Jesus Christ that is liberating, that is compassionate, that stands in solidarity with the suffering people. I think that sometimes we cannot see history with a very monolithic understanding. That is why a post-colonial understanding of Christianity enables us to see the multiple layers. In any particular historical situation, it's not just the colonizers. Why just read their history? And that is why in my teaching, I help my students to understand, yes, there is colonial Christianity, but we need to see there may be opportunity to subvert this and build something that is new, something that is emancipating. I believe Jesus Christ was a colonized person, and therefore following Christ opens my eyes and other people's eyes who have been formerly colonized or enslaved to look at the gospel anew.
And I want to highlight, especially for those who are joining us, one reason why you say that that is who Jesus Christ is because he lived under the rule not of the British Empire but of the Roman Empire, who at the end of the day had the power to execute him. And the cross is not in origin not a religious symbol at all, but is a means of execution.
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Before we shift a bit and look at another figure in the New Testament, namely Paul, before we look at Paul, there's one other point that you make in this introduction that I think is just fascinating. And you also see a comparison between this marriage of Westernization and Christianity. You compare it to the globalization of markets. And that's fascinating. So we've got the spread of the gospel, the spread of Westernization and Western culture. And now what is most dominant is the spread of the market. Say a little bit about that, please.
Yes. I don't know whether the audience has been to that part of the world. That is where Paul traveled. I wished I went to Corinth, Thessalonica, and Athens, and those places that Paul had traveled when I was much younger in the beginning days of my own teaching. But I did have the opportunity to go there. And then I can even imagine those cities in Paul's time. Because when we look at it, even from now, you will see those vibrant cities. You can imagine Paul talking to different people and to different sectors of community. And because it was the Roman Empire, so Paul was able to travel to these different cities. And so when I look at the Roman Empire, certainly I compare to the empire that we have experienced, which is not localized. Today's empire is much more financial, much more neo-colonial, and it is not sending the army to colonize a place in Africa or Asia or Latin America. We don't need to. We just can talk about the debt. And right now we are talking about the debt in the United States. Isn't this interesting?
Yes.
As we speak these several weeks. And I think globalization was then became a very familiar phrase since the 1990s. Before that, we had a different imaginary of the world. Remember that we have the first world. We belong to the first world, United States, right? And then we have the second world, Soviet Union, and then the third world. When in 1989, the former USSR collapsed or disintegrated, so the second world was in a big turmoil. And so that kind of imaginary needed to change. So then we said we are now more connected, not divided into first, second, and third. So we had, especially in the mass media and also in academy, we use the term globalization to talk about now we are in a globalized world with the movement of labor, resources, and capital. So this market is very important. Why? In former days, colonization means we go to find other markets and we need to exchange. And that is why, unfortunately, we have the Atlantic slave trade. And then today, we don't need to have this trading of resources like this, and we have other ways. And the market has reached the furthest corners of the world. If you have a cell phone, you can sell something, isn't it? So then today, when we talk about empire and when we talk about neo-colonialism, we need to have new kind of theology to respond to what is happening in our world today.
It's very interesting. Well, as we shift to talk some more about Paul, I do want to invite all of our viewers, if you have a question, please put it in the comment section. I will note it and I will ask Pui Lan to address it. So please ask anything. So Paul's identity in the New Testament is fascinating because Paul is, in his own words, he is a Jew and a Pharisee. And we also know that he's a Roman citizen as well. So he is the definition of complex. We were just doing a Bible study on Paul last week, and one of the questions that came up is how Paul died. And I gave the example that, and this is a gruesome example, but in Christian tradition and in Christian mythology, it's believed that Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, was killed by the Roman Empire under Nero, but because he was a Roman citizen, was not crucified as other martyrs of the faith were, but was perhaps beheaded, which was considered to be a less gruesome form of execution. All of which is just tragic, but it's a lens upon which, and a political lens upon which, to think about Paul's identity. And you've done a fair amount of work on Paul's identity. Describe Paul for us.
Yeah, let me just say Paul is such a controversial figure in the New Testament. Why? You can read Paul from many different vantage points. And now let me just highlight something. There was a debate whether Paul was a Christian or a Jew. And then there was another debate going on. They talk about whether Paul's gospel is liberating for women or it is calling for women's subservience. Women should not speak in church, for example. And there is also other inquiries about Paul. And so I think Paul is very complicated. But let me just, from my vantage point, Paul is an educated person in a time that is not many people are educated. So he's an intellectual. And then he's a Jew, a Roman citizen. I was ethnically Chinese, but I had a British subject passport because I was born in Hong Kong. Okay. And then now that passport would not allow me to live or go to England because before 1997, that was changed. Okay. But I was a British subject, a Chinese ethnic person. So I related to Paul being a Roman citizen and a Pharisee, an educated
Fascinating.
person. Paul was wrestling with his identity all the time. So sometimes you will see, Paul said this, but then in another letter, Paul said something else. So sometimes you wonder, who is the real Paul? Of course, scholars debate, whether Paul wrote all those epistles attributed to him. But I tend to look at Paul with some kind of sympathy. That is, he had very complex negotiation going on. He had to speak to those people in Athens, right, who knew about philosophy but did not know the name of the God. Okay, and then he had to speak in the Jewish community, and then you had the debate going on whether Jews who became Christian, whether they needed to be the Gentiles needed to be circumcised. Can you see that he was put in those very challenging moments? Today, Richard, we talk about identity politics. Isn't Paul caught up in talking about identity politics all the time?
All the time. And this is so fascinating. I'm so glad you said that, because one of Paul's gift to the church, from which I certainly benefit, is the debate about what the followers of Christ, what parts of the law they do and do not have to uphold. And the side of history fell with Paul, not Peter, on that question. So for Paul, what is it, Pui Lan? After the council in the book of Acts, Gentile Christians, had to avoid sexual immorality, and but did not have to be circumcised. Had to uphold the law of love of neighbor and love of God and love of self, but did not have to avoid eating pork. So it's fascinating. Paul gave us tremendous freedom as Gentile Christians in the gospel. And so that's such an interesting thing to think. That's why I'm bringing up Paul, because think about Paul from a post-colonial lens. He sets up these communities. So it's, say, in Corinth, in the first letter to the Corinthians and second letter to the Corinthians, and he stays in touch with them, but he also sort of lets them be. And they have local leadership, Chloe and Apollo. They have tremendous amount of freedom. So you've got the gospel coupled with freedom. So again, the opposite of Christopher Columbus, is it not? Or is that an oversimplification?
I think that Paul was recognizing he did not have that much power over these local communities. And so sometimes, depending on the audience, he will say, tell them, I am Paul, and then I have suffered and something like that, to appeal to them. Remember that? And then sometimes he would not be less pleading. So I think that Paul was recognizing that these different churches, and they needed to have their leaders, and he greeted them, right? And then say that they are his co-workers. So I think that he also left behind a kind of helping the church to grow, to wrestle with many different issues. And I think he was accommodative sometimes, and then sometimes he challenged them as well. So I think from that point of view, Paul also had a lot to teach us today about indigenization of the gospel, about ecclesial leadership, and about Christian mission.
Yes. And in summary, Paul in the wrong hands is terrifying.
Mm.
But Paul, at his best and our best, allows for local communities to have a lot of freedom, and that's freedom to use their own architectural styles, a lot of freedom in terms of gender roles, a lot of freedom in terms of authority, a lot of freedom in terms of what on the ground is necessary in relation to the gospel. That's Paul at his best and our best, I would say.
Yeah, very well said.
Well, I want to think about. I want to give a different example and shift us just a bit again. And I want to tell you a very quick story and connect it with something that you have written and see if you see the connection agree with the connection that I'm drawing here. So the story is this. I don't know if you've been up the road from Atlanta to Swanee, Tennessee. Have you been to the University of the South yet, to Swanee? Or to
Yes,
the School
I
of
have.
Theology?
Yes.
So you're an Episcopalian, I'm an Episcopalian, so it's an Episcopal university. There is a seminary there where I received my master's degree from the seminary there, and there's a chapel there. Actually, there's a lot of chapels. Swanee has like 3 or 4 or 5 chapels, but the seminary chapel is newer. It was built in the last 20 or so years, and the seminary chapel, up until very recently, has a crucifix on the end of it that is the center of attention from the moment you walk into the church. And this crucifix has the body of Christ on it, and it's a body whose skin is fair like mine. And so it's almost like it's pretty close to a kind of white Jesus in terms of the skin color. And so that pulls the crucifixion in an entirely different direction, just that skin color. And so what the new dean of the School of Theology, Jim Terrell, and the faculty decided to do is to take down that artwork, that crucifixion, and commission a new artist named Laura James to develop a new scene of the crucifixion. We were honored to have Laura James as a guest in the Dean's Forum a few weeks ago. Laura James is an African American based in the Bronx and very, very influenced by Ethiopian iconography. Long story short, what she's produced is a stunning crucifixion. Well, it's actually not a crucifixion scene. It's a Christ being raised from the cross, a kind of Christus Rex, but not as royal. Christ's skin color is darker, so he's a person of color, if not an African American. And then there's all this other imagery. There's Mary and John, the beloved disciple. There's tree of life imagery that hovers over the whole thing that's stunning. I think about that because it's a powerful example of transformation in a very Western setting to a new image of Christ on the cross. But the reason why I bring it up as well is because you have written in the book that we've been referencing, you have written of post-colonial feminist theologies, and here's the quote, commitment to subvert the use of sacred symbols that oppress people. And I want to ask, would that changing of the crucifix at Swanee be a kind of example of something you would support in light of your words about subverting the use of sacred symbols that are used to oppress people?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question. I also wrote in the book, there is this particular space between who Jesus was as a historical being and who the Christ is. Everybody who is a Christian or denominations and churches needs to answer Jesus' question, who do you say that I am? Isn't it? And this is ongoing. So the church, when it was built, or it was decorated in a certain way. And they answered that question in a certain way with a more pale-skinned Jesus. But today, the community gathered around the same crucifix may want to have a different symbol to symbolize their transformed consciousness. We have no historical record of the color skin of Jesus.
Yes.
It might be pale colored because I was in Bethlehem, and then I saw someone with very pale colors skin, and then I also saw people with darker skin. So we do not know the skin colored of Jesus, the historical Jesus. But then today, we have to answer the question, who do you say that I am? And the community in Swanley may think that today we need to imagine anew, especially given the Black Lives Matter that we have witnessed in the last couple of years. And I think symbol should be living. It is not set in stone or painted on wood, right? But it has to be growing. And as our awareness and consciousness grow, and then we see that a white or pale-skinned Jesus had been associated with colonizing, enslavement, or white hegemony. So today, we come to that awareness, and then we transform the symbol as a gesture of enactment of our transformation of consciousness. That is really liturgy in its best sense, the work of the people. And then that particular cross now symbolized what the people gathered have come to a deeper understanding of the gospel and of salvation.
Yes, thank you for that. Fascinating. And that's, thank God for artists like Laura James, in addition to theologians like you, but the artists, literally open our eyes to the colors of the gospel stories, to the colors and reality of our own lives. And so I think what you and I are both hoping for is a gospel that is both that is post-colonial, that is rigorously truthful and intellectual, and imaginative, colorful.
Yeah. Richard, I have watched that interview you did.
Oh, did you? Yes.
Yes, with Laura James. Why? Because I am also fascinated by artist work. I imagine in theology, we are talking about the God that we cannot see by words, right?
Yes.
Usually. But the
Yes.
artists are doing it through images and symbols and color. More tactile, isn't it?
Yes.
And more appealing to our senses. And sometimes,
Yes.
and then it affects our emotions or our deepest passion for God. I want to let you know too. And in my course, teaching at iLive, on Tuesday in my class, we are talking about different images of.
Oh, good.
And I have asked the students each to select either a song or an image of Christ that impressed them to share with their classmates. So I think that that is why I have been always saying, sometimes people ask, when you are a post-colonial theologian coming from a former British colony, how can you be an Anglican? Because the Church of England, right, belongs to the empire that colonized you. I always said, well, I do not perceive Anglicanism only from the colonizer's point of view, though. And I have appreciated the kind of art, have been using art in my teaching and to challenge ourselves. And today, when we are living through the pandemic, with so much around us, so depressing, I think the artists of our generation, of our time, needed to come up with the symbolization of hope. And it will be a fascinating topic to discuss further. But I appreciate your interest in art as well.
Thank you, and that's a perfect transition. You are an Episcopalian, and congratulations! You this year have received the Landfrac Award, which is a part of the Lambeth Awards, given to theologians and thinkers from the Archbishop of Canterbury. And when you received the award, the citation from the Archbishop of Canterbury lauded you as, and I quote, a remarkable individual who's brought a unique and much needed voice to Anglican theological thinking, particularly in America, but also well beyond. Your Asian, female, and Anglican identities are a key locus for your work, and your focus on exploring your own story, of developing new hermeneutics, has opened spaces for others whose stories were unseen and unheard. What a remarkable quotation. Tell us about receiving this award, if you don't mind.
Richard, I was so surprised because you did not need to apply or send in your CV, and you just received this email from Canterbury saying that congratulations, Professor Kwok, you have been offered this award. So I was very grateful to the Archbishop for this very kind and generous recognition, because I think for someone like me, a female, a non-European, to receive this award is very important.
Yes.
It tells the Anglican Communion our voices are valued, our work will be recognized. And I receive it with the kind of humility, knowing that this is not only for me, but for many women coming from the global south, coming from former colonies who have worked very hard, and then to advance a gospel that is liberating for all of us and for the salvation of the planet. So it was very gratifying and very humbling.
Well, I would like to ask, as we begin to finish up, just a quick response from you about being an Episcopalian. I think that, and what I want to ask is obviously you think so deeply and write so eloquently about the Christian faith. You also, as an Episcopalian, pray, which is not, praying is not exactly thinking. What's that like for you? You're a theologian and someone who prays to the mystery of God and not just thinks. So in other words, you when you're praying, try to experience God, not just have something to say about God. Would you talk about that?
Yes, I love to, because I think prayer is very important for me. And so it is not just in the church or in corporate worship, but in my own devotion and my everyday life. I see prayer is seeking God's presence in my own life and also respond to the situation of the world. I pray for the Afghans, especially when on television I see the children there. And although I may not be able to help them immediately, but I remember them in my prayer. And I ask God's presence to be with them. And today, when we talk about 700,000 of people in the United States alone who have died, that is a very huge number, very tragic, isn't it? And sometimes the soul or the mind is not cannot bear such kind of suffering and tragedy. And so I think that prayer for me is to ask for God's accompaniment and presence, and to lift up those people that I cared about, and to ask God for God's grace and mercy. But most importantly, I think prayer is decentering ourselves. Like the ego, it should not be the center of it. That is, decentering ourselves, be open to another presence, God's grace in my life. And I think that is very important.
I wonder then, since you just said that, if silence, the silent parts of the liturgy, and whether that's just not knowing what to say, or that's a kind of silent reception of God's presence, or an awaiting upon God's word, or a nudging from God or the angels, is silence then important to you as a theologian?
Silence is very important because when you silence yourself, you hear something new, something that you have not spoken or other people have not spoken. And maybe also in that silence, and then some of your internal dialogue can happen. And in those silent moments, in our tradition, we call it contemplation, isn't it?
Yes.
That is, again, your spirit, your soul will be at one, hopefully, in those moments, or to be integrated so that you come to greater awareness of who you are and greater appreciation of the world around you, and also being very mindful of the mystery of God. I like Anglican liturgy is because the word that is preaching obviously is an important part, but there is symbolic gestures. There is moment that you don't say anything in that part of the liturgy, isn't it? But you are present, just watching, the cup being lifted.
Yes.
Okay? And all these kind of symbolic gestures have been very powerful for me. And sometimes we say too much, as theologians do. And that is why sometimes I begin classes with a pause or with meditation.
Dr. Kwok Pui Lan, we are so grateful. I am just humbled and delighted to be with you. I do want to highlight your upcoming book. It's called Post-Colonial Politics and Theology, Unraveling Empire for a Global World, and there's a link to it in the comment section. And I want to highlight that you and I get to continue this conversation. You and I are going to do a Bible study together. So on this coming Wednesday night at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time, we're going to do a Bible study together, and all of you are invited. You can simply get on the church's website, sjcathedral.org, to view this Bible study, which will be live and in real time. And you and I are going to look at Matthew chapter 15, which is includes the story of the Syrophoenician woman. And I hope it makes everyone excited to join us when I say that it's the one example of Jesus losing an argument. And the fact that Jesus loses this argument to the Syrophoenician woman takes Jesus's own theology and imagery of the kingdom in some new and broader directions. And I think it'll be a perfect story to look at in light of your theological work and the subject of post-colonial theology. So everyone, please come join us this Wednesday at 5:30. Pui Lan, thank you.
You're most welcome. It was lovely talking with you, Richard. We'll see you and talk again this Wednesday.
I'll see you then. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.